Welcome everybody, and thank you for tuning in to this lecture on Science for Greater Equality from Public Policy. My name is Sarah and I'm half of the lectures team at the Cambridge University Science and Policy Exchange. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce our speakers, Professor Danny Dorling and Professor Andrew Stirling. This introduction is being filmed after the fact due to some technical difficulties, so I can tell you with absolute confidence that what follows is an engaging and lively discussion of some of the biggest challenges facing scientists and policymakers today. Our speakers discuss how to achieve equality in policy outcomes, as well as how to support equality within the scientific discipline itself. After a quick introduction from me, both of our speakers will present for around 15 minutes, followed by plenty of time for discussions and questions with the audience. So to introduce our speakers. Danny Dorling is a professor of geography at the University of Oxford who works across political sciences, geography and the environment to look at issues of housing, health, employment, education and poverty. He's written a number of books, including Inequality and the 1% and Slow Down, and is a regular commentator on issues of social inequality and resource allocation. Andy Stirling is a professor of science and technology at the University of Sussex, where his work also spans many disciplines to improve social and environmental outcomes. He's been on a huge number of advisory boards, including EU expert committees on energy policy, science and governments, and making sense of science. Tonight, he shares with us some of his huge experience in navigating the politics of science. So, without further ado, I'll hand over the virtual microphone to our first speaker.
And some of what I say may annoy you, some of it you may agree with. That's absolutely fine. That's why we need lots of time for questions. My view about science and policy when it comes to equality is that often science can harm attempts to increase equality. Often it doesn't know it's doing that, or the people advocating the science don't know they're doing that. And that can make it particularly dangerous. So if you're interested in doing good and you're a scientist, you're into very dangerous territory. Part of the reason for this, and this is particularly acute in the United Kingdom, where we are, is that quite a lot of policymakers and politicians actually believe that inequality is a good thing, that some people are much more able than others, that some people are much more deserving than others, that the lower orders need to be kept down and under control. But they don't put it like that. They often say that what they're doing is going to make things more equal. It's just that in their head, equality is not what might be, I hope, in your heads. Famously, scientists in the past have produced theories of eugenics and inequality, and actually the kind of the rationale for bigotry has been produced through science. So really be beware, and particularly because the people advocating this stuff do not think in their own heads that they're promoting inequality. They think they're being practical and sensible and doing the best that can possibly be done for those who are not quite as clever as them. And that somebody like me is actually going to harm people if you believe my kind of theories. A friend of mine, very eminent professor towards the end of her career at the moment, received an invite today from a right-wing think tank asking her to join a panel of key thinkers on how to reduce poverty. She laughed slightly and wondered what was going on. And then she noticed that they had only men signed up. And clearly they hadn't bothered to Google her enough to work out she wasn't even going to reply to their email. But these men, for this right-wing think tank in Britain, this email was sent around today, they don't think, oh, we're trying to promote inequality. These men think they're going to be promoting practical, sensible politics that may make Britain great again, may make it richer, may give opportunity to the rare person who needs to be dragged out of the swamp and promoted upwards. You know, they think they're levelling up. Levelling up is a great phrase. It's the current government's phrase, and what I particularly like about it, if you think about things like I don't know, life expectancy in Britain, where the highest life expectancy is in areas where it's gone up by more than a year recently, which is impossible to sustain. These are areas that have gentrified incredibly. Or wealth is that you can't actually make everybody as wealthy as the wealthiest person, or live as long as the longest lived person will live. Um, it's impossible with all the gold in the world to actually do that. So there is an automatic disingenuousness that's there. There are people who believe that for the economy to work, those who might be lazy need to be afraid of poverty. So they need a stick um, to frighten them. Or at an extreme, that they need to be frightened of going hungry. There's a famous phrase that hunger is much more effective than the overseer's lash. Or at an even further extreme, that they need to be afraid that their children will go hungry. And if you do something like provide free meals for children in families who are poor during holidays, you'll actually be reducing the incentive to work. That incentive, awful, isn't it? That incentive being that your child will go hungry. Um, it's a very brutal world out there when you look at it this way. And the other thing you get very often is disingenuousness. Um, you will not understand this, so I will not explain it to you. I will tell you I'm doing one thing, but actually I'm doing another. And we can all be fooled by this. I was fooled for years and years. I couldn't understand when the government came in. I think it's in 2010, the coalition government, and they had all these policies, help to buy and so on, about the housing market. And I couldn't work out why they were doing it, because the government constantly talks about the need to make it possible to buy houses and how they want to help young people to buy houses and be housed and so on. And this is a true story. I gave a talk at the Treasury once, and a senior civil service came up to me afterwards and said, "You do know that what we're actually trying to do is make houses as expensive as possible." And I said, "What do you mean?" And I feel really stupid. He said, "Well, don't spread it around, but we have these measures of economic success. And one of them is the house prices in London. And if London is the most expensive city in Europe, that means that we're winning economically. The market sets the level of the price. People will only stay if they can afford to buy homes or pay the rent. High house prices mean you're doing well. But obviously, we don't tell the population that, because they're all upset because they're having to pay this rent and these prices." And I just felt really stupid. And he was being nice. He was being honest. Um, and there are a set of people who believe that there is kind of some kind of god of the market, and having thousands of people homeless on your streets in London isn't a sign of failure, as opposed to other places. Um, think carefully about things like equality of outcome or opportunity. It's really easy to say that you want equality of opportunity for everybody to be given an equal chance, because that lets you off when the outcomes don't actually materialize at all. And it's particularly favored by people who actually believe in inequality. Most of you, I'm sorry, a stereotype, you're probably far too, well, I don't know, because you're locked up at the moment with COVID. So maybe some of you are watching The Crown. If you are watching The Crown in the recent episodes, watching Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s is a good example of a scientist who believed in inequality. She believed that there were tall poppies and they should be allowed to grow, and she was one of these, of course. The giveaway always of advocates of inequality is they think they themselves are special and more clever than other people. And they can't hide it. The most famous one recently, he sort of resigned on Friday. He stage managed carrying a box outside a particular door because he's so important. He had to do that to himself. Dominic Cummings wrote her own little thesis about his theories about people and so on, and where he thinks he's superhuman. So if you're not aware of your own fallibilities, if you don't think, actually, I'm not that special, there's a danger that you could be one of the narcissistic ones who, though you may think you're helping, are not helping. We're a social animal. Us and the naked mole rat are the social animals amongst the mammals. Majority of people are pro-social. Estimates say about 80%. It's only a minority who are not particularly pro-social, and only a tiny minority who are psychopathic. But it's dangerous. I think I've got a couple of minutes. I was going to end by reading you out just a couple of things from a colleague who was involved at the high up level with the current scientific kind of argument of the day, which is COVID. And this colleague had an argument with, I'm keeping it absolutely anonymous, the other scientist involved in COVID advice, and fell out with them. But these are recommendations, and they relate to equality as well. And the kind of thing was, and this is basic science as well. Science has nice rules. Provide clear evidential basis and grading for any recommendations. Always identify the uncertainties in the science and areas that need further inquiry. Sounds really boring when you're writing papers, but if you think about COVID policy, it's vital. Advocate robust studies of harms and costs and benefits of complex public health interventions before you do them, such as, in this case, masks and mass testing. So don't make children wear masks in school if you don't know that it actually helps. It could possibly harm. Mass testing in Liverpool may actually harm. Before making any such policy recommendations, actually consider the downside of things. Sounds really simple, but the fact we haven't been doing this for 8 months, and we're human. The people involved in this are all quite able scientists, but the fact that they disagree with each other is a lovely example of how none of us are that clever. I think COVID's a brilliant example. New disease. With old diseases, you can kind of pretend that the trick of an academic like me, the basic trick is constantly pretending you're clever. I kind of have to because I'm called a professor. And so the way you do it is you talk about history and examples and you write a book and another book. What throws you completely is something completely new, or fairly new, like the fifth coronavirus, where you don't know what's going to happen come the autumn. I don't know what's going to happen come the spring, and luckily I'm not an epidemiologist. Sorry, just last two ones from my friend, because my friend sent this to the other scientists privately when everything fell apart, but I thought it's useful to share it. Acknowledge and consider other views and scientific opinion on interpretation of cases, hospital admissions and deaths. Pay attention to heterogeneity of immunity and endemicity, the idea of a disease being endemic, before advocating complete elimination and suppression, zero COVID, which you may have heard of, which is kind of gone now. Adopt a whole system approach and always see opposing scientific views and opinions as a gift and an opportunity to be skeptical and learn rather than as the rival camp. And to do that, you've got to not think of yourself as superior. So scientists can help public policy towards greater equality, but particularly if they don't think that they are more equal than others. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Danny. That was really interesting. I'm going to pass along the pin to Andy now, and we'll hear from you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great. Well, that was great. Thanks, Danny. And I'm afraid we're not going to get a fiery debate here between two opposing views. I am going to, though, be complementary in some ways, aligned with many of Danny's central points, but complementary in the sense I'm going to look at this from the science side of the title and pick up a few things that Danny's really helpfully made, especially in those last couple of minutes. Actually, I would say, though, before I start, that it may be an issue for discussion, that for me, what you said, Danny, really leads to a skepticism about the whole mobility agenda. And that might be, never mind equality, what about mobility? I think it's actually far more toxic than it seems, but let's come to that. So there's a feature of the contemporary politics of science. I work, as was introduced, in a place called the Science Policy Research Unit, looking at the way science works around policy and in its own right. And one of the biggest tropes that is out there in the world, within science itself, as well as in policy debates about science, is the emphasis that's given to, if science encounters issues of inequality or power at all, then it is assumed that the basic challenge is one of speaking truth to power. I don't know how many times colleagues here have heard that phrase, but that's where the emphasis lies, rather than recognizing how even inside science, power shapes truth. So, for instance, the language of sound science in regulation or evidence-based policy, very topical at the moment in all the COVID-related health interventions. The idea that science is a definitive basis for policy, that you can base a policy definitively on science or evidence without there being other factors that are going to be crucial in shaping what that is. So what's going on then is that there's implicitly a denial within and around science that there is actually politics inside science, and that the knowledge that science produces is at least partly reflective of patterns of power and privilege that go on inside research. So in this sense, in addressing inequalities and power and privilege of many kinds inside science, within the practices and the institutions and the cultures of research, are actually crucial actions if science or research is more generally to be able to have any kind of role in addressing wider inequalities. And we're really blocked from that kind of debate at the moment because of these tropes that science is somehow free of politics, free of inequalities. And I have to say right at the outset, I don't know how this present gathering will be, but statements like this can normally get you in quite deep trouble. I'm not in any way meaning to denigrate the value of science, let alone the integrity of scientists when I say this. Actually, I have my work is motivated by an enormous respect for science. Because science actually does often try quite hard to resist power in knowledge. It's got many distinct forms of norms and practices to help in this, like the communitarianism that's supposedly a norm in science, the license to skepticism, basing arguments on evidence, peer review, of course, open publishing. Now, of course, all those qualities are massively compromised in reality, but they are in fact aspirations. And even at that level, if you contrast science with other areas where knowledge is produced, in religion, in political domains, in many areas, other areas of society, these are actually quite distinct institutions. But the trouble with science is if these aims turn into claims, that rather than just being things science tries to do, that it actually claims that we actually do this in science, then it becomes part of the problem. And especially if they're just assumed to work, that somehow because of these institutions, science somehow is an equal domain in which knowledge is looked at dispassionately, irrespective of special interest. And it can lead then to complacency and fig leaves. Science then suddenly becomes especially dangerous, not because it's an especially bad place for inequalities to shape knowledge, but because the idea that it actually is neutral and objective gives a fig leaf for other interests to hide behind. And we see that daily. We see it every time there's a press conference on the COVID-19. The actual iconography, the performance of hiding behind experts is almost physically realized on stage in front of us. So just to be a bit more concrete, some examples of these kinds of inequalities inside science, of course, relate to differences of privilege between scientists, different institutions, systematic disadvantaging of women still, ethnic minorities, working class people in science is a massive and less visible gap. But there are also differences of privilege across countries, between languages. The hegemony of the English language is a massive injustice in global science, blocking certain kinds of knowledge production. And then crucially, among disciplines. There are very intense hierarchies between different disciplines that we talk about routinely socially with each other, but very rarely when science funding is being allocated or science policy decisions are being made on the basis of those disciplines that regard themselves as being, as Danny was mentioning, superior. But these aren't just irritations within science. These actually matter because these kinds of inequalities between institutions, between disciplines, can actually turbocharge particular kinds of understanding and force specific sorts of innovations and suppress others. I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. But before I do, I think these kinds of problems of inequality in science and on lots of different axes are all the more important because the way in which power works in different kinds, the allocation of resources that constitute inequalities within science tends to be so suppressed in scientific and wider policy debates alike. There's a kind of a naivety about science among many people, sometimes a rather knowing one. The press, will treat science in this caricature fashion. There's a sort of romanticism about science in wider culture that then can be used by special interests, as I mentioned earlier. And this, although scientists, of course, themselves know, warts and all, exactly how science is from their own experience, and they know it's not like this, there's a kind of convergence of interest, hubris and self-interest on the part of scientists themselves, especially when they engage in policy debates, makes them play to that storyline as well. But that's not where it ends, because there are a whole series of further forces around science that take advantage of those existing inequalities and the hubris and self-interest there is in suppressing them, because these kinds of structural forces in politics, in business, in civil society as well, stand to benefit from the fallacy that science can arbitrate the truth in ways that get rid of these really inconvenient ambiguities and uncertainties and biases. And that idea, that kind of mythology of science, is very useful in the crucial business of procuring justification. So for instance, these sound science rhetorics I mentioned, which are not just in speeches by politicians, they form the basis for the World Trade Order. The World Trade Organization presides over a structure of law which requires that, even with this terminology written into it, that all countries of the world regulate trade solely on the basis of sound science. In other words, there is no consideration that can enter food imports or imports of consumer goods or chemicals, biotechnology, that is not based on sound science. And this typically conceals the fact that, for instance, the science in question is typically generated by the very corporations who are producing the products. So it's policed to varying extents by regulatory bodies, but the science itself, the risk assessments, the data that these conclusions are based on, is produced in-house, typically speaking. And then within politics, the dynamic of the minister or the prime minister standing behind the scientific advisors, an Oxford-based, actually, former chair of the Food Standards Agency was told on entering the job that by the minister concerned, "I will not hesitate to hide behind you at every opportunity." This kind of dynamic is well known. This dynamic of justification that, in fact, what a typical politician, and one can actually understand this at a human level, is most worried about is not whether a particular bit of advice is right or not. It's actually how exposed they are if it's wrong. That's because the value is, it doesn't really matter if something is wrong, if it goes wrong, if the politician has got a way to justify why they made the decision they did, even though it in retrospect turns out to be wrong, or manage blame management. A lot of the kind of apparent conundrums in risk debates can be solved by a little bit like Danny said about the housing issue. If you say this is not about actually determining the correct level of risk, it's about managing blame and externalizing the exposure of the most powerful figures like the ministers or the corporations behind them. And this is why we see such emphasis on issues like public trust, meaning trust by less powerful people of more powerful people, rather than the other way around, which is equally a matter of trust, or public acceptance and so forth. So these are the real drivers behind the way science works, and they are massively unequal in the gradients that they have. And when these inequalities and sources of bias within science are ignored, then the resulting research can have the effect of significantly exacerbating wider social and political inequalities. So, for instance, give a few examples of this. We're entrenched interests around technologies that favor the incumbent interests concerned with the production of the research or the innovation behind those technologies, to then play to the advantage of privileged groups around the world rather than poor and marginalized communities. So, for instance, take a look at the enormously greater effort that goes on behind, and we see it now with the vaccines, curative pharmaceuticals in general, rather than preventive health. There's hardly a public health disorder in the world that isn't more cost effectively addressed by preventive social public health measures rather than pharmaceuticals, and yet the money is spent massively on the science side. Likewise, in agriculture, standardized intellectual property intensive seeds, the idea that particular seeds can function optimally all around the world, irrespective of which country you're in, what the climate's like, whether you're on the north side, south side of the valley, highlands, lowlands. These are really quite extraordinary kind of fallacies that we've got ourselves into believing, because intellectual property intensive seeds are so valuable as a business model. And what we see then from that is massively more resources spent in science on that type of innovation rather than on diverse ecological farming techniques, for instance, which draw on traditional practices, learning from the knowledge of farmers themselves, and innovate involving farmers as partners in that. Likewise, the high value supply chains behind energy resources, fuels like oil or gas, are massively more promoted in research than even now, with the remarkable changes underway in the world at the moment, distributed renewable energy sources. It's still the case that there's more research expenditure in those old areas. And military spin-off technologies. Military is, when I last looked, it was a couple of years ago now, actually, but I gave evidence on this to the British Parliament, that public expenditure on the military science is the largest single category of public expenditure on science in the world. And we hardly ever talk about it. It's hardly the disciplines that are so critical on other fronts, in energy or in agriculture or in IT, artificial intelligence. There are very vibrant critical communities. Around the military, it's really interesting how relatively sparse that is. And so spin-off technologies like nuclear power, at the moment in the UK, the debates about nuclear power are impossible to understand without seeing those invisible inequalities, massive, massive inequalities in the ends towards which science funding is directed. So these neglected inequalities in science are not only directly aggravating wider social inequalities, but they can really gravely undermine the democratic struggles that are essential to addressing these inequalities. I don't know of a single axis of inequality that hasn't basically been, to the extent it's been improved at all, that's been through collective action, social mobilization. But the kinds of societies that this scientific language that I mentioned at the beginning of evidence-based policy, for instance, is pushing us towards is undermining of democracy. It takes away the space of democracy by implying that expertise can adjudicate issues that in the past were openly regarded from all sides of political debates as a matter for politics and as a matter for democracy. And so what's happened is then we're whitewashing out, sidelining, airbrushing out the crucial role of uncertainties and ambiguities in science, and leaving it with this kind of authority because of that odd conjunction of interests I mentioned at the beginning. So yeah, I mean, it's in all these ways that science in its present forms can seriously intensify these wider problems of social and political inequality. And science could, just to draw my sort of spiel to a close, could help much more to resist these effects if it were more open and honest, if it were to say in public what it routinely says in the pub about its own internal cultural and institutional and disciplinary inequalities of power, especially between different kinds of applications of science, rather than acquiescing to this kind of pretense that science is somehow apolitical. So the answer then lies not in pretending that science is value neutral or free from internal politics, which is a real temptation in these days of Johnson-esque, Trump-esque authoritarian populism, but in acknowledging that science is part of an ongoing struggle against the many ways in which power shapes knowledge. And I say that because we can go right back to the beginning of my talk to sort of finish it, really, because science is in many ways descended from past struggles for equality. In the domain of knowledge production, it's in itself a social movement. I mean, take the motto, a long-standing motto from the 17th century of the Royal Society, nullius in verba, not on authority. That's deliciously ironic nowadays because it appears on the front cover reports that are actually all about asserting authority, asserting unequal legitimacy and rights over knowledge. But when it began, it was actually on issues like, for instance, the ones I mentioned, fracking or GM foods or nuclear power. So that's how science is behaving now. but the motto is a clue to how it used to behave and how it's got the potential to behave as a social movement about equality in knowledge production and free from the coercive power of religions or monarchies that was the original beef for the founding communities of science. So I think that by recovering this early promise of science as a communitarian, open, popular arena for highlighting and exploring uncertainties, at the time in the 17th century, it was highly restricted, of course. It was men, it was rich men. But in principle, the institutions and norms that were developed then applied to society at large. And so rather than this closed hierarchical elite platform we have now, which Danny talks about as well, asserting supposedly definitive authority on every single issue that comes in front of it, I think the science can be turned around, and scientists can play a great role in turning it around to fulfilling the real potential of science as a field of knowledge production as part of these democratic struggles for social equality, which we may never win fully, but the whole point is the struggle itself. So yeah, I don't know if that was addressing the kind of issues you wanted to talk about, but that's my little take.
Fantastic. So thanks you so much, Andy. So I would like to now open up to questions for you both, but I'm going to selfishly start with one of my own questions. I was wondering, you both talked about uncertainty, and particularly you at the end there, Andy, in science, and sort of how that plays into policy making. And obviously there are a lot of uncertainties in science, and scientists are I think, relatively good at identifying those uncertainties and sometimes qualifying their recommendations with it. But how does the interplay work between those uncertainties and policymakers who need to both implement sort of concrete policies as well as influence people's behaviour, for example, where uncertainties can create ambiguities about whether these changes are necessary?
Yeah. Do you want to have a bash, Danny, or shall I?
Okay, I'll have a bash with one example, probably not one you're thinking of, but take policy on education. We had, long before you were born, we had an education minister called Kenneth Baker, who decided that he had a very certain idea about education, and so he'd introduced something called the national curriculum. So children had to be taught particular things at school. Teachers weren't to be trusted. A more recent education secretary, Michael Gove, is very sure of his views. He absolutely no doubt that, as far as you can see in his face. And he revised the national curriculum more recently in a particular way and direction. Now, in a normal European country, and there's variation, France is different and so on, but you trust the teachers because you don't think as an elected politician you're an expert on education because you have some idea of uncertainty. So it's a great example, I think, of where supposed certainty about policy actually results in a pretty bad educational curriculum in England that you don't see elsewhere, because of a politician is so sure of their own ability to intervene. And if you're a young child now, because of Gove, you have to learn particular kinds of grammar in an English school, but imagination, that's not to be encouraged at all, because that could lead to terrible things if you start imagining. Sorry, Andy.
Yeah. Well, actually, complementary to that, then on the science side of this issue, you're saying, I think you're right, Sarah, to say that scientists are pretty good at acknowledging uncertainty. In fact, scientists are typically motivated by uncertainty. It's quite central to why science is such a wonderful thing to be engaged in private discussions. But in my experience, sitting on quite a number of scientific advisory committees, I would say the scientists in that context who think what they're doing is helping the Michael Gove type dynamic that Danny just represented, they think they have to somehow come up with closure. Sometimes that's quite cynical. You don't get an OBE or a knighthood as a chairman of a committee by going to the minister with on the one hand, on the other. So partly there's incentive like that, but also there's a desire to be useful. Scientists think, even if they're not ambitious in that sense, that unless they come up with a single view of what they know to be a massively uncertain field, then they're not really being helpful. And this is a toxic dynamic. And it's important because I have yet to see an area. I've been like 30 years now researching these issues in chemicals, biotechnology, medical field, military, nuclear issues, and across the board. I really, I think this is so important that I have yet to see an area where the evidence cited in favor of one particular course of action couldn't, if you went back to the peer-reviewed literature as a whole, justify any of the actions in play in principle. In practice, in all the areas I mentioned, the uncertainties are so large that within them it's possible to justify perfectly reasonably, without corruption, just by judicious choice of framing assumptions and interpretations, any of the main choices in play: renewable energy or nuclear power, organic farming or GM foods, electric or other kinds of propulsion systems for cars. It's really remarkable how big these uncertainties are. And again, when scientists typically they think, or the norms that are most highly privileged, the quantitative norms of probability theory come out, a scientist saying uncertainty will typically mean probabilistic uncertainty, which is not uncertainty. Uncertainty means a condition where you can't apply probabilities. So actually, I actually would dispute that in the context of public policy, scientists are good at acknowledging uncertainty. I think they're actually the main blockage and the main source of denial that it is as serious as it really is.
Thank you both. That was really great answers to my question. Thank you. So we have a lot of questions coming in. So Charlotte has a question for Professor Stirling. If you'd like to unmute yourself, Charlotte.
Hi, sorry, I have a bit of a dodgy internet connection. I hope this goes through.
Sorry, Charlotte.
Thank you so much for the great talk. This is really interesting. Yeah, so this is a question hello?
Charlotte, sorry, your connection isn't very good.
Maybe type your question.
Yeah, maybe type your question and we'll ask it for you.
Yeah.
So a couple of people raised their hands. Eleanor?
Hiya. Yeah, so I was wondering what your thoughts were sort of on the increasing popularity of using deliberative democracy to sort of tackle these science policy issues. For example, sort of through citizens' assemblies, like the French Citizen Assembly was in response to the Yellow Vest protests, which were sort of raising the issue of inequality and a science-led climate policy. So yeah, I was just wondering if you thought this was an improvement or if they're really worth the hype, because yeah, they're increasing quite a lot. Thank you.
Again, Danny, do you want to? I've got a thought on that.
I always can. So you'll be careful. You'll let us in. I can always come up with an answer. The one I like it, but it's exhausting. Is my summary. Where I've seen it work best is the real living wage. Researchers at the University of Loughborough every year produce how much money do you actually need to live on, which is always higher than the government's minimum wages. And that's done by getting a panel of people across section together in a room and the Argos catalogue and various others, and just going through items saying, does a child need a wardrobe? What kind of wardrobe will do? Or my favourite example is, does a pensioner, should they be able to feed birds in their garden with a bird feeder? And a panel who discussed this decided a pensioner should have enough money in their pension to buy a bird feeder, but if they want to put grain in it, that has to come out of their disposable income. You know, they might have to go hungry for that. So getting people to talk who come from a very wide range of backgrounds can result in something as good as a set of minimum wages, which are now widely accepted as this is the amount of money you need to live a decent life. But it takes weeks and weeks. And then you've got to go and do it again next year because things change.
Yeah. Actually, a slight little hint of something. I might take a slightly different view than Danny there about the exhaustion. Because yes, you're obviously right, Danny, that these processes can be exhausting, both for the people involved and for the wider society, sort of having to engage in them in various ways. But actually, typically, what they can avoid both in spending money and time on policies that are ill-informed, that are framed in the wrong way, can actually be less exhausting than going down the wrong way with a more expert-based approach. But my own view on them is that they're necessary but not sufficient. I mean, they are they're a crucial part. Participatory processes, bringing in different groups, especially when they're weighted towards the most marginalized groups, are really important. And then deliberative practices within those, they're not the same thing. You know, you can be more or less deliberative, more or less participatory. So they all are part of the solution. But if they're treated like a magic bullet, then they're definitely part of the problem, because in the end, they're exactly subject to the same processes that science is. There's not that there's these pressures for closure. So for instance, it's no coincidence that some of the main techniques are citizens' juries, which crank out a verdict, or consensus conferences, which crank out consensus. So just like the scientific committees, the idea is the only way you guys are going to be useful is you give us a particular recommendation, which we can then hide behind. And yet, just like sausage making, you know, just like a science committee doing that is not a pretty sight. Likewise, a participatory practice is forced to generate a consensus. It's not a pretty sight. There are all sorts of things, and I've seen them up close, have to happen in order to do that. So I think the key to making participatory deliberation part of the solution and not part of the problem is just like with science. Open it up. Say, we don't want you to recommend one thing. We want you to tell us what the alternative things that look good are and the reasons why, so that democratic processes more widely still make the decision. They're not eroded by this, they're invigorated by it, and accountability is reinforced in democratic debates rather than being sort of assigned to delivery processes which are run by consultants and often stitched up in really quite horrible ways. So that's, for me, it's the same basic prescription. Open up deliberation, open up science, so that they don't just recommend single things.
So Charlotte has put her question in the chat, and it's related to what you're saying, actually. So Charlotte asks what your recommendation is of the most effective division of labour between science and policymakers, in policymaking, I suppose. Recognising the interdependence between science and policy seems to suggest shared labour, but it seems that we also have lots of reasons to want to keep them separate from immediate policy concerns.
Well, I mean, in terms of, in a way, do what it actually says on the tin. If you look at Britain has got a particularly hierarchical, a particularly managed, the coloniality of British government institutions shows in science. If you compare it to a country like Germany, and I've been part of it by a strange quirk of fate, going to Germany with British science delegations to argue for these chief scientists' practices, which I then on the panel was arguing against. So it's really kind of, Britain has this adversarial culture, but at the same time wants this hierarchical control of science by a single chief scientist. But if you look at the documents behind that, what you see is surprisingly clear positions on the division of labour. That, you know, for instance, advisors advise, ministers decide. That actually is quite a helpful principle, because it underscores that if an advisor is simply preempting a particular decision in some way by only giving one recommendation, then they're actually violating that division of labour. And it very rarely gets put that hard, but if you look at the different guidelines, they actually hold in place, always account for uncertainty. It was read out, Danny read out one of these accounts from the, I think, the Bob Mays guidelines from a few years ago in his talk. So if we actually did those things, highlighted uncertainties, not give just one recommendation, but give the reasons why different recommendations might hold, then that division of labour could be better. And you can have interconnected, and, you know, you need scientists and policymakers to be talking very tightly about different things, but you want other people to be able to look in and see what the different possible conclusions might be.
Yeah, I agree. Nothing to add for once, rarely.
We have a couple of other questions in the chat from Myred and Colin. And I'm going to merge them together, but if either of you two would like to chime in and ask your question yourself or expand on your questions, then go ahead. But they ask about the sort of relationship between politics and government with a capital G and science and policy making. So, you know, if the science community is unwilling to publicize the politics taking place both within the research process and without, how might that be addressed, asks Myred. And Colin asks, you know, what can we sort of gather from statements from scientists about their alignment with governments and with politicians?
Let me have a go naively on the alignment one. Is fascinating. Because nobody is politically neutral. We all have a politics. If you don't think you do, it's probably not a particularly nice one. And it's tricky. And so it's a bit, only a few people, of course, are privileged enough to ever be asked as scientists to be advisors. And a key just geographical one. I mean, to be involved in SAGE, to be in some of these things. Essentially, if you live in London and work in a London university, it's much more likely and easier than outside. But absolutely, some people will refuse to with certain governments. I was asked repeatedly to be on some panel about ethnicity of this current government, ironically as a white, middle-class, very posh man. But I don't believe for a minute this current government has any real interest in inequalities by ethnicity. I think it was a smokescreen. It was arranged by somebody involved in a very odd group associated with the University of Kent. I won't dig myself in any further, but I thought no. And he said that there is another thing that goes on, and it's very sad, and it is the baubles, the OBEs, the MBEs, the CBEs. By the way, if you want to know the difference, it's about how posh your university is. Oxford and Cambridge, it's a CBE. If you look at the 70-year anniversary of the NHS, when a whole series of these awards were given out, and remember they got the word empire in them. It's pretty old-fashioned. You could actually see which famous medics decided not to take the awards. And if you have an idea of being neutral, if you're trying to be neutral, even though you know you can't, there are certain rules. One, obviously, is you do not take tobacco money. But then there's a whole process from what money do you touch? All money's dirty, but the dirtiest is tobacco and then arms. And part of that process is also some people will not take honours because it's a form of corruption. And I'm because you're a relatively young group, I can say that it will be very painful for me to say this in a senior room in my university with colleagues who had taken them. And what you constantly get are people saying, I took it because I was a woman and not enough women get them. I took it because I belong to a minority. There's endless reasons people give for taking something which is for good behavior and keeping your nose clean in a certain way. And I simply don't like it. It's also very odd. Other countries do not do this as much. And it's kind of worrying. We need to get better. I think in the UK in particular, and the honour system, hidden, secretive, and celebrating an empire and so on, it's not good in science. But our supposed top scientists, other than becoming an FRS, which is another thing, but at least they police that themselves. At least there isn't a committee of the great and the good, as it's called, sanctioning. Sorry, went on a bit. Andy, go on.
No, I mean, again, in what you just said about the ways it's complicated, the ways in which one view of equality, the mobilities that on the face of it look really desirable can be one of the most toxic things because they can be used to shore up structures that are just not changing for other reasons, like the sort of system of honours you mentioned. But on this point about government, I do think it's beyond the dynamics we've just been talking about. These structural forces, like the new public management, bigger than science itself. The idea of new public management, that things get evaluated and measured, and proliferation of metrics. This erosion, this confusion of the domain between policy and politics. It's interesting. English has got the two words. Some other languages don't have those two words. Everything is politics. But in English, we've got policy, which is this tame, domesticated, colonized domain, subject to power structures that we don't really talk to. We're in denial. It's all deliberative. That's policy, and that's okay, evidence-based policy. But outside that is politics, and then you get people denying that there is politics in order to get into the policy domain. So this politics denial is engendered by new public management and by this, especially in the UK, but it's not just a UK syndrome, is, I think, really corrosive. It's a bigger scale thing, example of the kind of thing I was talking about within science, politics denial. So I'm really concerned about it. It also happens with their governance, moving from government to governance. The idea that you can then pronounce on governance in a definitive apolitical way is a similar sort of syndrome.
The next question is a question from Flora, who asks whether we should abandon the ideal of neutral and objective science in the context of everything we've discussed today, the evidence-based policy making, and if yes, what should the new ideal be to replace it?
I mean, I'll chip in. I'm nervous about the idea of abandon, because there's a very important baby in some rather horrible bathwater here, and I tried to get at it at the end of my spiel, because yes, if the science is pretending at neutrality, pretending at objectivity, pretending at being free from politics, then yes, we definitely need to move away from that. But that's not what science is about or should be about. It's about exploring uncertainties, exploring questions which are ever more open-ended. And so part of this debate may be in the mind of that question, behind the question about what we do about authoritarian populism. Somehow the right has captured what I think is basically a backlash to this overbearing expertise in new public management and the regimes I mentioned, like the WTO around the world, where there's less and less space, and environmentalism, which I'm an environmentalist, but environmentalism has been a major shock front of removing politics, turning it into science. Look at climate change, for instance, which is a hugely important issue, but the idea it's somehow driven by science rather than values is both completely disabling of climate change and also having a toxic effect on the backlash, which is then a plague on experts, like Michael Gove was mentioned earlier, and that whole plague on experts thing. So it's giving an excuse for this whole post-truth, or what Obama's now calling, truth erosion. So I think that don't throw out science. Remember that the whole point about science is about questions. There are always questions to be asked. There is never a final answer. Even in a definitive body of physics, there is no final answer. There's just successively more and more penetrating questions, and it's a fractal world. That there's no area so tied up that you can't blow it all apart with another question of the kind that wasn't expected before. That's what science is about, and that kind of quality can really help engender a kind of humility in public debates.
Yeah, I'd agree. One way to look at it, I think science is our great hope on a lot of these things, but to try to imagine somebody looking back 50 years from the future at now, when it will be possible to determine if we went up a cul-de-sac of a wrong idea, when there were all these different options, because the evidence-based policy, the idea that the evidence points at one thing, is never quite true. But you can look back at history and decisions that were made at various times and say that in hindsight was a more sensible one, and that one which you thought was led by science, including some awful things, was terrible. So keeping that in your mind of an imaginary person 50 years ahead looking back is I think one way that can help.
Thank you both. Recognizing time, we might have to skip a couple of questions, so I really do apologize if I don't get to all your questions. But we have a question from Orla, who asks, Danny, you talked a lot about policymakers who aren't interested in addressing inequality, even if they say they are. And Orla was wondering how you approach conversations with these people or these groups to make meaningful change on reducing inequality. And she asked whether it's a lost cause.
Okay, the way I do it, and it's changed over time, it might be because I've got lazy and old. I divide these people into two groups in my head. Those who I think are lost causes. So I'll give you an example. Somebody arguing for keeping the statue of Cecil Rhodes in my university because Rhodes was a good man. Opportunity cost. I don't like economics that much, but the effort of trying to dissuade that colleague compared to what I could do else with my time. and then people who may say things that I disagree with if I think I'm right, but I think there's wiggle room. It happened to me the other way around today. I was chairing a meeting where we were talking about reducing the number of part-time places that we'd offer for PhD students, because part-time students are a bit of a pain. They carry on for 6 years, so why don't we just offer less places? And my colleagues, to their great credit and my eternal shame, refused to introduce this policy that would make our life hit easier on the grounds that this was discriminatory and you should, just like you let people work part-time. So that, great example of me getting it completely and utterly wrong. But I was just thinking, oh, life's so much easier if people finish their PhD in 3 years. So divide people into two groups: those who might change their mind, and don't waste your time if you're absolutely sure somebody won't. But beware people like that who desperately want to say keep the statue of Rhodes up, not telling you they want to do that, but finding ways to divert you, saying, oh, we'll have another committee. We're minded to remove the statue, but we must decide what we do with it. So we can't remove it until we decide where it's going. Often people who want to keep inequalities going are a bit self-aware that their opponents will attack them if they come out front, so that they do devious things. And you're constantly in a battle for this. Access, which students get to university. Nobody says in my university, I want children from private school to go to university more because I think they're cleverer. But a very high proportion of my colleagues send their children to these schools. A third of the children of Oxford go to private schools. The majority of academics' children in Oxford go to private schools, right? And if you wonder why our access hasn't widened wider than it is, it might just be the interests of the people who are making the decisions. So, be a bit aware. It's really easy to be naive, and it's easy to think the best of other people, which is good. But then you may well not change things quite as quickly as you'd like them to be changed.
I just very quickly, I think that's really good. I agree with it, but there's also another side in which there is no one. The forces that I regard, when we take inequality agenda seriously, the forces are structural, and people, no matter how privileged they are, at the end are caught up in those forces. They may be utterly deluded and Machiavellian in the way that Danny just suggested. Often that's the case. But there's also, at a human level, some of the most potent ways of pushing forward emancipatory politics is by reaching out to someone who is on the opposite side and finding there's a little bit of judo to be done. At a human level, there's enough bandwidth. So sometimes I think the general heuristic is right about the opportunity cost, but don't underestimate the power of human contact to actually sometimes really trip up some of these structural forces. So with the two things in tandem, I think that you can, emancipatory agendas can be taken forward.
Thank you. It's 6:59, so I think we have to wrap up, but that was a fantastic note to end on, and something really that we can take forward. So thank you both, Danny and Andy. That was a really, really great discussion, and we didn't get to all the questions, but I think I definitely took a lot out of it. And so thank you very much both for your time and your sharing your knowledge with us.